This edition of FYI. I'm your host, Charlie Mager, and joining me today is the voice of the St. Louis Blues, John Kelly. John, good morning.
Welcome, Charlie. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you. Today's topic is called Blues 50, and will cover the history and tradition of the St. Louis Blues. So let's get right to it, John. What made you primarily a Blues fan? Was it your dad, or was it just growing up in the St. Louis area?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, our family came from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and my dad moved here the second year the Blues were in the NHL. So I grew up as a hockey fan. I played hockey in Canada as a little tyke and a mini mite and things like that. I skated on ponds, and coming to St. Louis, I continued to play hockey. And of course, because he was the voice of the Blues from the second year on, it just grew my love for the game even more, and I would go to a lot of the Blues games. And so I would say it's a combination of me playing the game of hockey and also, loving the Blues and listening to the games and watching on TV. Those are the reasons why I became such a big hockey fan and a big Blues fan.
Who was your favorite player growing up?
Without a doubt, it was Barclay Plager. He was a captain of the team. He went on to coach the team. He was a heart and soul kind of guy, a really talented defenseman, but also very tough. And he would block shots, he would fight. Of course, his brothers, Bobby and Billy, played for the Blues. Bobby is still around, now in his 50th year. His jersey's going to be retired coming up in a few weeks, and it'll go up in the rafters at Scottrade next to Barclay's. But Barclay was always my idol. I just liked the way he played. I mean, every single game he laid it on the line. And would do whatever it takes to win. Tragically, Barclay developed brain cancer in the mid-'80s and passed away in February of 1988. But I think about Barclay a lot. He was not only a great hockey player, but a great leader and a great person. So without a question, all time, it was number 8 Barclay Plager.
So the Blues begin with 3 straight Stanley Cup Finals appearances in the late 60s, but I wouldn't say that excitement and euphoria necessarily carried over into the 70s. They failed to make the playoffs on more occasions than not during the 1970s, and they also faced a financial crisis. They eventually had to be bought from Purina, I believe it was, in order to keep the team in St. Louis. Do you know much about what happened there and what could have affected the Blues?
Well, as you said, they had 3 great years to begin the franchise going to the Stanley Cup Final. I mean, it was incredible. But then the ownership group led by Mr. Sullivan Jr. and then Sid III, they made some bad decisions. Number 1, they fired Scotty Bowman. And then number 2, his replacement, Al Arbour, who went on to win 4 Stanley Cups with the Islanders, he was let go. So they made a lot of questionable personnel changes. And then what happened in the early 70s, Charlie, is that the World Hockey Association came into existence, and there was competition for players. And what it did is it drove up salaries. So the Sullivans had a hard time competing in the mid-70s, and they had to sell. And they finally did find a buyer in Ralston Purina, and they did a great job with the Blues, and they tried to bring hockey back to where it was in the early 70s and things like that. But then, for whatever reason, they sold the team, and they almost moved to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. But then, sort of out of the blue in the early 80s, Harry Arnest, an entrepreneur from California, came in, and at the last second, he bought the team. And instead of going to Saskatoon, of course, Harry Arnest bought the club, and they stayed in St. Louis. And then, the Shanahans bought into the team after that and things like that. But there were a couple of times, particularly when the Solomons were selling the team, and then when Ralston was trying to sell the team, that the Blues came very, very close to moving to other cities.
So you have to follow up on that. So you don't think that the team would have stayed in St. Louis had Purina not come by and helped out?
Well, it's hard to say. It didn't come as close to leaving as when they were selling, and then Harry Arnest came in. I mean, the summer that Harry Arnest bought the club, the Blues did not participate in the June entry draft. And I remember at the old arena, I know you're too young for this, Charlie, but there were weeds literally growing in the parking lot. So basically, the franchise was almost abandoned. And again, at the last second, Harry Arness bought the club, and history says they stayed, and they had some very good years. But I don't think they came quite as close to leaving the first time when the Solomons sold to Ralston. But obviously, anytime you have ownership changes and things like that, it's not good for the franchise. But they're still here, and right now they're prospering, and that's great to see.
Good. Well, and then Purina, as a matter of fact, they fell into a little bit of a financial crisis themselves. I believe it was in the late 70s and early 80s, was it?
Yeah, obviously that's a company that is still in existence and doing very well. Mr. Hal Dean is the one who was the chairman of Ralston at the time, and he had a chance meeting with the former president and GM of the Blues, Emil Francis. And he told Mr. Francis, if your club is ever in need of help, my company will help you. So just because of that chance meeting, when the Solomons did decide to sell, Mr. Francis remembered that conversation, and he called Hal Dean, and that's when Ralston stepped in. I don't know what happened as to why they wanted to sell the Blues off, and obviously, as I said, they sold to the Orness family, but obviously it's a big company. Maybe they felt the team wasn't good for their portfolio, or they were losing money. I don't really know. But, under their ownership, they kept the Blues, and they had some really good teams under Ralston, especially in 80-81 when they had 107 points.
All right, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, at the dawn of the 1980s, St. Louis fans would experience some of the greatest hockey one could ever hope for, and began a streak unprecedented in St. Louis sports history. We're going to go take a break, and when we come back, we'll have more on the Blues of the 80s. Don't go away. Welcome back to FYI. I'm your host, Charlie Mager, and with me is the voice of the St. Louis Blues, John Kelly. So John, where we last left off, we talked about the financial crisis that the Blues were going through, that Purina was going through, right around the time of the late 70s and early 80s. The Blues seemed to have needed a little makeover, if you will, or a change of fortune, and in the early 80s, that seemed to have happened. So during the 80s, your dad was in the pinnacle of his broadcasting career. How exciting was it, and how inspiring was it to listen to him and watch him as the voice of the Blues for so many years?
Well, he was obviously a great announcer, and I had the thrill and the privilege of sitting next to him many nights at the old arena in the press box, and just watching him work. And I also had a chance to be a spotter for him on football. Not a lot of people today perhaps know, but he was a very good football announcer. He did a lot of college football for Mizzou, and also for the Big Red, the football Cardinals. So I'd get a chance to spot for him at Mizzou games or Big Red. So it was a huge thrill. I mean, I remember one weekend, Charlie, my dad took me to Columbia for a Saturday game. We left on Friday, drove down to Columbia. I spotted for him in the booth in Columbia. After the game, KMOX arranged for him to come back to St. Louis in a state patrol car to get him back in St. Louis in time for the Blues game that night. I sat next to him in the press box. The next day, he had to do a football Cardinal game at noon. I went with him again. So here was a young guy. I was in my teens at the time. So in a span of about 30 hours, he broadcast 3 games, 2 football games and a hockey game, and I was with him the entire time. It was just, I'd say it was a great weekend for a young sports fan and a young guy that wanted to be a broadcaster sitting next to him.
During the 80s and 90s, and this is a remarkable fact that all diehard Blues fans should know, during the 80s and 90s, the Blues made the playoffs every single year. 25 straight years, the St. Louis Blues made the postseason. When the team's winning and doing well, doesn't it make watching the Blues and broadcasting the Blues just that much more exciting?
Yeah, it makes it more exciting for everybody, for the players and the coaches, for the fans, for the broadcasters. I know my job is a lot easier when the team is winning because, there are more positive things to talk about. And, as a broadcaster, we never want to be critical of the team, although at times you have to be critical because that's your job and you have a job to do. But it's a lot easier to see the team scoring a lot of goals, to win games, and we always want to be positive when we can. So yeah, obviously to have that run of 25 Stanley Cup playoff appearances in a row is quite an accomplishment. The one negative to that, Charlie, I will say, is you never draft really high. You know, when you're finishing in the top 10 or 15 of the league, you're not getting the very, very best players in the draft. Of course, the Blues did finish last overall in 05-06, and they picked Eric Johnson. So that's the one thing about that, is when you have that run of continued success, although it's great, sometimes teams that win championships, they really bottom out for 3 or 4 years and get a lot of top players, like Chicago did with Taves and Kane. And that's why they, of course, have won 3 Stanley Cups in the last 7 years. So, you know, that's the one thing I will say, is even though that run is great, conversely, you don't get the very, very best players in the draft.
So do you think that might have a little bit to do with the Blues making the playoffs, but then having an exit in, let's say, the Western Conference Finals or the semifinals? Do you think that maybe a few years of mediocrity is necessary to get that 1-2 punch that the Blues need, especially losing, you know, Backes and Brouwer and Elliott, to make that next step to the Stanley Cup Finals?
Well, it's you know, there are a lot of reasons why the Blues over the years, and you talked about the 25-year run. Of course, they went to the Western Finals in 01, lost to Colorado. I was with Colorado at the time. That was the year Peter Forsberg was hurt in Game 7 of the second-round series. He had a splenectomy and couldn't play the rest of the playoffs. So the Blues had a great chance to beat Colorado in that series. But Roman Turek, the goaltender, didn't play well enough. He was outperformed by Patrick Waugh, and the Avalanche won the series in 5 games. Last year, the Blues, of course, back to the Western Final for the first time since 01. And, you know, they gave San Jose a really good series. But I think in hindsight, having to play 2 7-game series against Chicago and Dallas, I think that hurt the team mentally and physically. And I don't think they really gave San Jose the very best they could have given them had they been a more rested team. So there are different reasons why, you know, teams over the years, you know, make the playoffs, or when they get in, they don't win. It's hard to win, Charlie. You know, only one team wins a year.
Right.
So you have to have, obviously you have to have a good team, a lot of talent, but also a lot of luck. And at times, the Blues haven't had that. I remember a couple of years ago, the Blues played Chicago in the first round, and going into that series, they were battered and bruised. They had a lot of injuries, and they won the first 2 games of the series, but then injuries caught up to them, and they lost the next 4 games and lost the series in 6. So, you know, in a case like that, even though they might have been close to Chicago, they didn't have the fortune and the luck, and they lost the series in 6.
Well, going back to fortune and excitement, let's go back to the night of May 12th, 1986. All diehard Blues fans know about the Monday Night Miracle, Game 6 against the Calgary Flames in the Western Conference Finals. Were you there for that?
No, I was actually a young broadcaster in the American Hockey League in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is near Toronto. I was doing the Leafs Farm Club at the time. So I was watching the game on television. Actually, as a matter of fact, my father, who of course was the voice of the Blues, but at the time, during that era, he was hired by CTV in Canada, and he was doing the game. So I sat at home in my apartment in St. Catharines and watched the game. And I think a lot of Blues fans would agree and probably say it was the greatest Blues game ever, certainly their greatest comeback ever, to be down by 3 goals in the third period, facing elimination, scoring a couple of goals late. Of course, Greg Paslowski scored the game-tying goal when he stole the puck from the goaltender Mike Vernon and stole it from behind the net and scored. And then, of course, the late Doug Wickenheiser scored in overtime. And I still remember that game like it was yesterday.
And then going back to your dad, before he passed in early 1989, what were some words of inspiration and encouragement that he gave you as a broadcaster going forward that you can give, let's say, to your son or anybody else who wants to go into that industry, of what broadcasting entails and what it takes to be a successful hockey voice?
Well, that's obviously a complicated question. There's a lot of reasons why, he was successful and things that he did to be successful. I would say 2 things, Charlie. Number one, to be as prepared as possible, and to work hard and to get your stats and your notes ready and to talk to people, the coaches and the players, and going into every broadcast, be as prepared as possible. And you just never know what's going to happen on any particular night or in any particular game. And I think the other thing, aside from being, professional and being ready to go every night, is to treat people well. And whether it's the players or the officials or, the owners, whatever, the fans, treat people the way you want to be treated. And I think that he always had great respect for people in the game. So I think if you do those two things, you're going to be probably ahead of a lot of people if you're prepared and professional and courteous and things like that. So I would say those are the two things that he did a lot and did very well, aside from being a great broadcaster. But those are things that everybody can do, not just the talented broadcasters or the great broadcasters, to be prepared, professional, and also very courteous and be a nice guy.
All right. We are going to take another break, and when we come back, new faces of Hall of Famers would shape the franchise, and the note would give their arch nemesis a run for their money and perhaps one of hockey's greatest rivalries coming up next. And welcome back to Blues 50. I'm Charlie Mager with John Kelly. So, John, where we left off was right around the late 80s, and that was right around the time that you began with the Blues. It was November of 1988, I believe it was, right around that time?
Well, I did a few games, actually one game with my father before he passed away. He was diagnosed with cancer in the fall of '88, and at the time I was doing some games for the New York Rangers on radio, and we had a game in Philadelphia, and then a few days later the Blues came in, so my dad suggested I stay around and spend some time with him because he was sick and I hadn't seen him in a few weeks. So I did, and I broadcast the game with him in Philadelphia that night, the only time I ever worked with him. As a matter of fact, the Blues that night won 3-1. It was their first win in Philadelphia going back to the early 70s, the night they had a big brawl in Philly when the Plaguers and others went into the stands. So they broke a long drought. That was, a historic marker in itself. And at the same time, I got to work with my dad. And so I did that one game, and then, unfortunately, he passed away in early February of '89. And then the next year I came to St. Louis and worked for 3 years for the Blues before leaving for 12 and then coming back in 2004.
Well, right around that time in the late 80s and then the early 90s, several notable players, let's say Brendan Shanahan, Adam Oates, Al MacInnis, Curtis Joseph, and then of course Brett Hull came around. Would you say that those are some of the biggest names in Blues history, especially Al MacInnis and Brett Hull?
Well, no question. Brett Hull, to me, is arguably the greatest goal scorer ever. And I know that, there are some people that have more goals than Brett, but as far as shooting the hockey puck and 86 goals in 91, Charlie. I called the Blues that year. And what's significant about that season, the record, of course, is 92 by Wayne Gretzky. Mm-hmm. But that year, Brett did not have any empty net goals, and he did not have any shorthanded goals.
Wow.
So, 86 could have turned into, 95 or even 100. Not to take anything away from Wayne Gretzky. He is the greatest player ever, right. And the stats obviously back that up. But I think Brett was, and still is the greatest goal scorer. And you talk about that era of the Blues. You could argue that, the late 80s to the mid-90s when they had, as you said, Oates and Hull and Pronger and MacInnis and some of the others, it was one of the greatest eras, if not the greatest, in Blues history. They had so many great players, great pieces, but they always just sort of came up short in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But there's no question that, in my mind, especially the team the Blues had in 1990-91, they were a really good hockey team. Oates and Hull were playing together. They had 4 good lines, but they made a trade at the trade deadline in 91, and they traded 4 players to Vancouver for 2. They got Garth Butcher back along with Dan Quinn, and the team was never the same after that, and they lost in the second round that year to Minnesota. I think if they would have kept that team together and not made a big trade when they were in first overall at the time, I think that team could have grown together and perhaps even won a Stanley Cup, but they didn't, and that's the way history goes.
Well, another big part about that era was from 1988 through 1993, the Blues and the Chicago Blackhawks faced off in the Stanley Cup playoffs all 5 of those years. What has the rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago meant to the two cities over the last 25 or so years?
Well, it's a great rivalry. It's it's like the Cardinals and Cubs, although that goes back obviously many more decades than the Blues and the Blackhawks. It's a tremendous rivalry, and I remember a lot of those playoff games in the 80s and the early 90s before Scott Trade at the old arena. Some nights there were more fights in the stands than there were on the ice. And that's saying a lot because there were a lot of fights on the ice. But the Blackhawk fans would come to St. Louis and, they'd get into it with the Blues fans, and just a great rivalry. And then both clubs have had their down periods. Before Chicago drafted Kane and Taves, I mean, they were not a very good hockey team.
Right.
And the Blues were. And then, of course, the Blues, out of the lockout in 04, they had a couple of really tough years. They finished last overall, as I said, in 05, 06. But now Chicago's an elite team, obviously winning 3 Stanley Cups in the last 7 years. And the Blues have become a very good team. So I think the rivalry right now, you could say, is as good as it ever has been, going back even 20, 30 years.
Does it make it more exciting or even more nerve-wracking when those two teams face off, as opposed to, let's say, the Blues playing, the Wild or the Blue Jackets?
Well, I don't think there's any question, Charlie. Whenever you play a chief rival and a good team, everybody is more amped up for the game. The games are better. The competition is better. You can feel a buzz in the air at Scott Trade. At least I can. When I get set to broadcast a big game or a playoff game, there's just a different feel. And the games are better. So there's no question that when you have 2 elite teams and 2 longtime rivals like St. Louis and Chicago, of course it's going to be a more exciting game, a more intense game, and just a better game overall.
All right, and of course the Blues and the Blackhawks are sitting atop the top two teams of the Central Division right now, and of course we would expect nothing else, would we?
No, and right now they're 1-2, and Chicago, after a bit of a slow start, they lost their first 2 games. They're back to where we thought they would be. They're going to be there at the end. They have a lot of young players this year, so sort of like the Blues, it's going to take a little while for everybody to settle in and maybe find their own level and things like that, and confidence. And the Blues obviously have been a little bit up and down, but of late they've played a lot better. But I don't think there's any question at the end of the day, after 82 games, that the Blues in Chicago are going to battle probably down to the wire for hopefully first place, and it should be a great season.
All right. We are going to take our final break, and when we return, we're going to briefly discuss the Blues and their current performance this season, as well as the future of the team. Don't go away. And welcome back to the final segment of Blues 50. Charlie Mager here with John Kelly. And so, with the way the Blues currently are playing, last season they finished one of their greatest seasons in their franchise history. They won 10 playoff games until falling just short of the Stanley Cup Finals to the San Jose Sharks. And then this past summer, they ended up getting rid of Brian Elliott, their captain David Backes, and Troy Brouwer. So what were your thoughts on that, especially getting rid of Backes and Brouwer both?
Well, you say get rid of. The facts are that both were unrestricted free agents, so it's a business relationship, Charlie. So the Blues can only do what they can do, and if those players decide to sign somewhere else, that's their prerogative and their right. So the Blues did talk to both Brouwer and Backes, and they wanted to sign, one or both, but they decided to go different ways. Obviously, Backes with Boston and Brouwer with the Calgary Flames. I was disappointed that they couldn't keep at least one, but that's just the way it goes. And you move on, and now the Blues have a different look. They're not quite as big up front as they were with Brouwer and Backes. There's no question about that. And they were both very good players, and both had great playoffs last year. But David Perron has come in this year, and he was signed as a free agent. He's done a fantastic job. So. He's sort of taken that spot, and at the same time, some of the Blues' younger players have continued to play well and grow, like the Robbie Fabbris and the Jaden Shorts. But that's just the business nowadays, Charlie. Mm-hmm. And sometimes fans want something, or even general managers want something. But again, that's the nature of the business, and the Blues, like every team, is dealing with a hard salary cap. So it's not as easy as it might sound, or the way things go sometimes aren't the way fans want, But that's just the business we're in today in the NHL in particular with the hard salary cap.
What are your impressions on Ken Hitchcock and the job that he's done guiding the Blues to the playoffs the last 5 years and what he's done so far this year?
Well, his record speaks for itself. He's fourth all-time in wins, and the Blues, since he came here, have been an elite team every season. And, you know, what I'll say about Ken Hitchcock is that he gets his clubs prepared to play every single night. He's a great tactician, X's and O's, and they have great structure. So I think when you look at the way the Blues play, but even more than that, Charlie, when you listen to what other coaches and players say about the Blues, that they're hard to play against, they're not fun to play against, you know, that's a credit to obviously the players, but also Ken and his coaches, because they're prepared every night. They play a hard game, a man's game, and they have great, as I said, great structure. So they're hard to play against, and that's continued again this year. Even though they're, as I said, they're not quite as big a team as they were up front. They're still a really tough team to score against and to beat because of the way that they're set up and the way they're coached.
And just a quick prediction before we go. Where will the note end at the end of the season?
I hope they finish in first place and win a Stanley Cup. I think that their window is still wide open to do well and to win a cup. They have a very good team. You know, who knows if the team right now is the same team that we see, you know, after 82 games going into the playoffs. Doug Armstrong, as GM, has not been afraid to make changes, make big trades. I'm not saying they're going to do that necessarily. Last year they didn't do anything for the most part, and then they went to the third round. So who knows what the team will look like at the end of the season. There are a lot of variables, including injuries, but I like this club. I think their defense is as good as any defense in hockey. They have very good goaltending. The offense is coming around, so you know, they have a good team, and let's cross our fingers. Hopefully, Charlie, in this 50th year, this is the year they win the Stanley Cup. You just never know.
Let's hope. Let's hope. John, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure having you on here this morning.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of FYI. Until next time, I'm Charlie Mager. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.